Hey guys, my name is Christine. What is up? So many of you probably know me from my retro video game speedrun channel on Twitch, and for those of you who don't, feel free to follow using the link in the description if you're into retro gaming or speedrunning or just live goofy content and silly puns, because we do a lot of that. Today I wanted to try out something a little bit different. As most of you probably know and is likely obvious by looking at me for more than 5 seconds, I am a trans woman, which means that I was born male, but then transitioned to the other side through the miracles of modern science and medicine. So I don't really talk a lot about me being trans or my transition on my Twitch stream or on social media, but this week I'm celebrating 5 years since starting my transition, so I thought it would be cool to break out a character and try making a video talking about my transition a little bit, the events leading up to my decision to transition, and sort of how my transition has changed my life, as well as some of my thoughts and feelings on being trans. So first, I'll give you a little bit of background on me. I was actually born in the early 80s in Nashville, Tennessee, but I actually grew up in kind of the semi-rural suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, mostly between Henrico and Chesterfield counties. I have a pretty big family that's mostly based there in Central Virginia. They're very much Southern conservative, hardworking, blue-collar, God-fearing types, and as such, I grew up with stock car racing and country music, all of the great and wonderful things the American South has to offer if you're into that kind of thing. Having two divorced parents who both struggled, I had a fairly modest, lower middle class upbringing. I had a lot of personal challenges growing up. I had pretty severe ADHD that went virtually untreated until I was like 8 years old. I also had lots of behavioral issues, and so it was really hard for me to make and keep friends, and it was equally hard to gain any sort of academic success in school. But outside of all of this, I was actually a fairly boyish child. I was into race cars and football and stuff like that, but it was also a pretty solitary existence, so I spent most of my time doing a lot of one-player activities like art and music, and to a large extent, video games. I had one or two guy friends growing up, but it always seemed like I got along better with girls. A lot of trans people, when they tell their story, will say that they knew very early on that they were born in the wrong body or express other such tropes, and that doesn't really sound like my experience, to be honest. I definitely had signs that there was something amiss about me. I tended to be a lot more fragile than other boys, and I tended to gravitate more towards female members of my family. A lot of people throughout my childhood kind of suspected that I might just turn out gay or something. To be honest, I did like to pretend to be a girl sometimes when no one was around, but it never seemed to cross my mind that I was anything other than a boy at the time. In fact, one of my big fears as a child was that someone would find out about my girl ideation and have me committed to some kind of a hospital or something. I think around the time I was 14, I kind of acknowledged that on some level I wished I was born a girl, but it's important to remember that I was being raised in a pretty conservative environment at a time when LGBT issues, especially trans issues, were considered something that only really affected like talk shows or like the back alleys of society. I was very much raised to believe that people like those in our family had a greater purpose in the world. I heard the term guardian angels used a lot when I was a kid, basically used to imply that there was a greater force protecting us from the ills of society. In my late teens, I was very much into the punk scene in the mid to late 90s, and I used that as an excuse to experiment with my looks and how I dress. I regularly dyed my hair and had a mohawk and would do other such things that presented a very shocking counterculture image of myself. In my early 20s, I moved out on my own and started experimenting with wearing things like long skirts and colorful accessories and other kinds of things that could be considered more feminine. At the time, it was becoming pretty evident to me that I wanted to be a woman, but even then, I never really considered that I could actually become one. Throughout my life, I've always been primarily attracted to women, even though I have considered myself bisexual on some level since I was a teenager. But as I went into my mid-20s, I started feeling pressure to have a family and go to college and all that, so eventually I succumbed to the idea that in order to be a successful member of society, I would need to make an effort to conform to what is being regarded as the quintessential adult. And so I cleaned up my look, went to college, and eventually started a family. In my late 20s, we moved to the Rockville, Maryland area near Washington, D.C., and in my early 30s, my internal cross-gender feelings started to surface again. Of course, this time, due to the growing prevalence of trans-related communities and information available, I eventually came to the realization that at some level I am, in fact, trans. It was during this time that I found a therapist to begin working out these issues, and after a few sessions, I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria and was referred to a gender clinic and got started on hormone replacement medications and began the process of coming out to the world. This is a point in my life I've always referred to as transition 1.0. Of course, this did not go over very well with a lot of people, particularly certain members of my family. And after about 4 months, I started seeing a lot of the changes in my physical appearance. And at that point, it kind of hits you that this is a real thing that's happening, whether you're ready for it or not. I had a hard time reconciling a lot of the different variables regarding how some people were reacting, plus the logistical issues of my career mixed with the emotional and physical changes. So after about 4 months on hormone replacement therapy, I just sort of caved into all the pressure and just gave up. I think in retrospect, I just wasn't ready, but in the end, I kind of felt that sucking it up and living as male was probably the path of least resistance at the time, and I had dealt with being male for the past 30 years, so maybe I can just do it for another 30 or 40 or however long I had left. And this whole charade of me trying to suck it up and be male lasted for about 6 years, and through this time I went in and out of varying levels of depression and anxiety. It was honestly horrible. I hated watching myself get older every day and the feeling that I was letting life pass me by. I hated the way I looked and the way people responded to me when I was interacting with them. Like, I hated the way that I was being typecast as a guy. I didn't take a whole lot of pride in how I presented myself, and so I always came off as a slob even when I was trying. I honestly just didn't have a lot of self-respect. I can't really explain it, but being male just didn't really suit me, and I found it to be kind of awkward trying to fit in with other guys. It was honestly miserable trying to be something I'm not, knowing full well the path to fix it was right there in front of me, but I was just too afraid to take it. During this time, I considered myself a closet trans, and that deep down I knew I was trans, but I was just kind of closeted about it and perhaps a little in denial as well. Around 2017, my mental health had really kind of turned to some dark places, and I had a lot of depression and anxiety at this point. I did have a coworker friend who I confided with around this time. She sort of had a really strong impact on getting me to realize that a lot of my anxiety was rooted in the fact that I was essentially driving myself crazy trying to suppress who I really was. All of it came to a head in the spring of 2017 when I finally just decided to take the plunge and start transition version 2.0. I remember the night I was actually watching old music videos and I just sort of made the decision that I basically just had to do it, and whatever happened I could just deal with it. Pretty much immediately I knew that I would need some sort of strategy for how to manage the consequences that it was going to have on my life. So one of the first things I did was to create some rules for myself regarding my approach to transition, and these are mostly sort of promises that I made to myself that would ensure that things didn't go disastrously bad like they did the first time. The main rule was to remember to make decisions based on what I want and what I felt was right for me, versus making decisions based on what others thought. I didn't really want to fall into this trap of trying to fit someone else's ideas about what a woman is or what a trans person is or how you're supposed to transition. It was fairly important that I not lose track of who I am or try to become somebody that I'm not. My strategy to prevent this onslaught of outside pressure and backlash was to just not involve other people in my transition any more than they needed to be. So with transition 1.0, I feel like the big downfall was this dramatic coming out to the world and expecting support from those around me. What I found was that people at the time were just rather unsupportive, or they would just make jokes or whatever else. It kind of injected a sense that I couldn't really maintain control of my transition because I had to be so focused on what everybody else thought. So for transition 2.0, I kind of decided that since a good number of people had sort of disproven their ability to be supportive and mature, that I just simply would not tell them. Like, I knew it was the right decision, and I really felt like it was the only decision at the time, and so I didn't really see any benefit to allowing people to express a lot of disapproval, so I essentially just created an echo chamber of support. As part of that, I never really came out at work or on social media or anything like that the second time. I never had any sort of big reveal where one day I was 100% male presenting with cargo pants and a football jersey, then the next day I was like in a dress with pearls and a full face of makeup and all that. It was a pretty gradual change. Hormones work really slow, and so I kind of theorized that if I was more conservative in making sure that I was presenting myself in a sensible way, people would just be less likely to be assholes about it, and then eventually they would just figure it out, and then by then it would be too late for them to change my mind. I also forced myself to temper a lot of the expectations I had for others, so I honestly never put a lot of stock into things like pronouns or anything like that in the beginning. I always kind of had this mindset that I wanted to be seen as a woman and I wanted to be gender correctly and all that, but I also wanted it to come organically, and I knew a huge part of that is understanding that I can't just expect people to magically see me as something different just because I asked them to. The end goal was for people to see me as a woman and to be gender correctly with the pronouns and all that, but I wanted that to happen organically, and honestly, I didn't even really consider myself a woman until I felt it was objectively clear that I was one in a sense. I do remember the first time someone organically referred to me as she. It was from a grocery store clerk, and it felt really good because I knew it was genuine. Finally, after several months, I was seeing a real-world impact from the amount of work and stress that I put into this major life-altering process. This person saw me as a she because they saw me as a she, not because I asked them to or because I had my pronouns on a pin or a name tag or anything. Nowadays, I'm referred to as she in a more or less identifiable identified as a woman pretty much without fail. The only exception are people who I haven't seen in many years or trolls who just don't count. But over time, it was a pretty gradual shift. And so I actually got to see that progress in real time, which I think proved to be a pretty invaluable experience for me. The first couple years, I went through what a lot of trans people would refer to as a second puberty. And during this time, there were a lot of hormonal changes that brought about crazy mood swings. There were honestly times where I would just go into the bathroom at work and just cry for 15 minutes straight for absolutely no reason. Honestly, the way you see the world changes, and the way the world sees you changes because you're undergoing this big physical transformation, and you're kind of finding out how you fit into this new world and how to move through it. So you're experimenting with your presentation, how you dress, how you communicate with people, etc. I don't want to get into all the physical changes because it's quite personal. I'm sure you can just read up on that yourself. But one immediate difference that I noticed was that my skin got softer and my face cleared up. I've always had problems with acne, even well into adulthood, and that simply has just not been a thing since cutting out the testosterone. I also noticed that my temperament improved quite a bit. I was actually a fairly quick-tempered person in my male life and would commonly lash out at people on social media or get road rage or whatever. This has largely become very much under control in the past few years. Since I joined Twitch in 2020, I've come to assume a more public-facing image for myself, which is something that requires a level of dignity and self-respect that I just did not have in my old life. As far as my name, Christine, my given name was actually Chris, and when my sister came along, I wanted her to be named after me since I was named after my older brother. And so they gave her the middle name of Christine, and so I just went with Christine. Also, I felt like if anyone ever called me Chris, then I could just say, well, Chris is short for Christine, so you didn't technically dead name me. So it kind of carried a built-in plausible deniability of sorts. But I think if I had chosen a name that I objectively liked, I probably would have gone with Mackenzie, but I'm happy with Christine. I think it's fitting. Anyways, after about 2 or 3 years, I just sort of settled into who I was, and I think I've honestly been on cruise control ever since. I still take my HRT medications, and I've had a few surgeries. I'm considering one more procedure to restore my hairline a little bit, and I'd like to get back into electrolysis at some point, but other than that, I consider myself more or less done. I understand that hormone replacement is a process that continues for years and years, so there are probably a lot more subtle changes happening that I just can't really notice. It seems like when I look back on pictures of me from 1 or 2 years ago, I do notice a subtle difference, but I think that could be said for anybody. So that's basically the story of my transition and how we got to today. I wanted to take some more time to talk about my approach to transition and how my attitude about everything has evolved to this point, because I think it's important to mention in regards to how I feel about my experience as a trans person and how I've maintained perspective. So 5 years ago when I first started transitioning, I was sort of in this honeymoon stage, right? Like I went to Pride and I had like a trans flag in my room and went to a couple of trans meetups and all that. But to be honest, I never really had a lot of success ingratiating myself in the trans community. I think there are several reasons for this. For one, I've always had a hard time just making friends in general. I just honestly find that I don't really meld with people very well in real life. And the older I get, the more prevalent that seems to become. But also, it might surprise people to hear that I actually have a worldview and political perspective that some might consider somewhat conservative. I don't want to get into my politics or anything in this video, but I will say that while I've always considered myself progressive in terms of LGBT acceptance into society, generally I find that I'm just not a very good trans person overall. So I learned kind of early on that while I might very well be trans, there doesn't really seem to be a place for me in the greater trans community. I kind of feel like I'm more LGBT by happenstance more than anything, and I think without a sense of belonging with the community and the feeling that I'm kind of marooned, I've ultimately become sort of jaded about being trans. Like, I'm fairly proud of who I am and the strength that it's taken to reclaim my life without compromising my integrity, but actually being trans to me is just sort of a thing that I live with, like my ADHD or my imposter syndrome or any other number of issues that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. I wouldn't say that I'm a big trans pride person per se. I would just say I'm more a woman who just happens to be trans. And to be honest, after talking with several trans people who have been in transition for a number of years, it seems somewhat common to get to a point where the novelty kind of wears off and you just get tired and want to live your life. This video is probably an exception, but you might notice I don't spend a lot of time talking about being trans like on my Twitch stream. I don't tend to put a lot of trans identifying marks or tags on my social media profiles or anything. It isn't really that I'm ashamed of it or I'm against the community or whatever. I'm just not really interested in making it a central focus of my life, and I don't want that to be the thing that draws people to me. A lot of trans people talk about the concept of stealth, which is when you basically transition and then just live your life in stealth. And while I don't think it's possible for me to be stealth because of how clockable I am, I do try to live a stealth-like, under-the-radar lifestyle as much as I can that's kind of tinged with a bit of don't ask, don't tell mindset. So, some of you may have heard the phrases clockable or passable in the past, and in simplistic terms, clocking is when you identify someone as being trans just by looking at them, and passing is when someone appears as and is interpreted as the gender that they're living. I do believe it is possible to be clockable and to pass, so people who have been in transition for a long time probably recognize the difference between how society treats you as a man versus how society treats you as a woman, and at this point, I would say that society more or less interprets me as a woman based on the interactions I've had with, like, acquaintances and people out in the wild. So while I do think I'm fairly clockable and that most people can tell I'm trans just by looking at me, I do think that I pass well enough just based on my interactions with society and how it seems I fit into the world. This might be a controversial take depending on how someone defines passing, but that's kind of how I see things. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Honestly, I don't really mind that people can tell that I'm trans. I mean, it isn't ideal. I didn't transition to be trans, I transitioned to be who I am. But despite whether or not I look trans, I do think that I pass well enough. And lots of cis women are falsely clocked as being trans anyways, and so I'm just kind of fine with it. And to be frank, I don't really have much choice anyways. The only time it does bother me is when people out in the wild clock me and then call a bunch of attention to it, or when people come right out and ask me, which is just kind of rude if you think about it. Often I see people who are starting out in their transition get frustrated or discouraged because they think they'll never pass or whatever. And I feel like if that's you, you're not really being fair to yourself. I don't think anyone early in their transition can definitively say how well they'll pass. I've seen some really surprising in real life results and some impressive timelines on YouTube and Reddit. And I really do think a lot of new transitioners would do well to be patient and remember to live in the moment as they move through their transition rather than think too far ahead of themselves and generate unrealistic expectations. My first couple years were a pretty big roller coaster as I moved through that awkward, ambiguous stage. But looking back, I think there was a lot of utility in learning to work with the process and figure out ways to grow with my transition instead of trying to work against it. I do think it's important to sort of know where you are and let the changes drive themselves. Hormones don't really care how you want to look or how you want to feel, and so it's a lot more about reacting to how your body is changing rather than expecting your body to meet your expectations, if that makes sense. I honestly think I'm pretty far from perfect myself. I mean, would I prefer to look like a 22-year-old bombshell supermodel? Sure. But that's a very unrealistic expectation given the variables. And so, while I do tend to get down and out about various things regarding my appearance, I like to remember that this makes me feel a lot better and confident than I did before, which was ultimately the point of transition in the first place. I think it's important to remember if you have gender dysphoria, the goal of transition is to alleviate the distress caused by your biological sex, not conform to some ideal image of a fictitious person. After you transition, you will still be you. You won't just magically transform into somebody else. I do realize this approach might seem a bit conservative and kind of know your place to some. And of course, I don't think anyone should be kept in a box or anything like that. Ultimately, I think people should just do what works for them. And as long as you're not hurting anyone in the process, you do you. Who cares? But for me, I think that this more practical approach has definitely worked well for what I wanted out of my transition, which was pretty much for a peaceful journey that eliminated the maleness as much as possible in a way that was more or less free of unnecessary drama. And I think that for the most part, that has been a successful goal. I was pretty much able to just do my thing and stay out of trouble without compromising who I am. As many of you know, I do live in a fairly liberal area of the country, seeing as how I live in Western Washington, which I guess helps. So I've been very thankful in terms of being easily assimilated and not being a victim to a lot of harassment or resistance from the Gen Pop. But to be honest, even the times I've spent outside of the area, including my travels back home to Central Virginia, were pretty much without incident. Generally, I feel that the vast majority of people just don't really care that you're trans and are too busy going through their life to give two thoughts about you. Sometimes I get a funny look from someone, which has become a lot less frequent in the past year or so. But as someone who was picked on a lot as a child, I've sort of cultivated a lot of strategies for how to deal with trolls and bullies. Mostly I just try to stay out of trouble and not put myself in situations where I might become a victim of such things. Of course, I do consider myself a rebel or a punk at heart, and so I do like to push that envelope just a little, but in a fairly safe and comfortable way. Intuition plays a huge role, as well as just avoiding problematic people, which transitioning does prove to be a pretty effective way of finding out who your friends and family really are. Acceptance among my longtime friends has been fairly positive. I honestly can't think of one friend from my before time that has even expressed any sort of disdain. And when I go back home to hang out with people I grew up with, I very much feel like they're very respectful and don't try to typecast me or anything like that. I feel very fortunate in that regard, but it's also a product of my ability to just choose good friends. My family has been sort of a different story. A lot of them, particularly older people in my family, are very set in their ways, and so it's taken a long time for a lot of them to come around, but it's a sliding scale. Some of my family, mostly cousins in my age group, were supportive from the get-go, and some swear that they'll just never accept it even after 5 years, and others are sort of somewhere in between. I'm happy to say that my mom and I have a fairly good relationship, all things considered, so I'm very lucky there. My dad and I haven't spoken since I informed him that I was transitioning about 6 months in, and I just don't ever expect to hear from him again, unfortunately. I do have two daughters who I have a great relationship with. My ex and I split up over 2 years ago, and we do a great job of working together to make sure the kids are happy and healthy and have everything that they need. Ultimately, I consider my relationship with my extended family a mixed bag and a never-ending work in progress. I've always been open to extending olive branches to those who want to have a conversation about things and express concerns. After all, they're family, and I was raised to think that family should always be a priority. But I also think it's more important for me to protect my dignity and not compromise on who I am. So at the end of the day, I feel like my happiness and my mental health are just more important to me than people who I only see once every few years, and obviously love and accept me under the condition that I live a life that they feel good about. In all, I would say that I'm extremely happy with my transition, all things considered. I honestly didn't really know how things would turn out, and so it was very much a leap of faith, but it felt like something I had to do regardless of the outcome, and in the end it proved to be the right decision for me. In the last 5 years, I have not had a moment of doubt about that, but I would say that everyone's experience is different, and so I would not consider anything that I've said to be a replacement for any sort of counseling or therapy. Anyways, there's a lot more that I could talk about, but I think that'll do it for this video. I've always thought transition stories are very interesting. Everyone has their own journey and obstacles and their own take on such issues, and so I thought it would be cool to use my 5-year mark to share some of my story with you all. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the things I've talked about here. I hope nothing I've said has been too controversial. I know trans-related topics can be fairly contentious, but I wanted to be honest and upfront in sharing this part of my life with you all. This is honestly the first commentary-based YouTube video that I've made. I've always wanted to do something like this, and I like the idea of making more of these, but I'm not really sure it's a lot of work. So if you like this video and have any ideas for future ones, please let me know in the comments. Also, please make sure you like and subscribe and follow me on the Twitters and Instagrams and other such things, and of course, make sure you follow me on Twitch. Until next time, take care everyone, and I'll see you on the flip. Bye!